and I'd like to introduce Dr. Cavanaugh. He's at the University of California at Los Angeles. He's a researcher at the Santa Barbara Coastal LTER, which is in Santa Barbara, as the name suggests. They've been in business since the year 2000, and so they're just completing their third 6-year funding cycle. So,
great.
All right, thank you very much. It's exciting to be here. And I'm going to continue on this theme of disturbance and resilience. This picture on my title slide is a Landsat satellite image of giant kelp canopy along the coast of Santa Barbara. For those of you who don't know, giant kelp is the world's largest algae, and it's found along temperate coastlines on at least 5 continents, where it creates these forests that support an incredibly diverse and productive ecosystem. And at the NSF Santa Barbara Coastal LTER, we're combining this perspective from 700 kilometers above the surface of the water with long-term in situ monitoring, the kind of picture you get if you're conducting a scuba diver survey of a kelp forest. And by combining these two perspectives, we've been able to make some interesting discoveries about kelp forest ecology. Now in Santa Barbara, we get a big swell event every few years. The local news stations put out these high surf advisories, surfers flock to the beaches. And if you're walking along a beach around Santa Barbara a day or two after one of these swells, this is the scene you might come upon. Beaches just littered with giant kelp that has been ripped up from the seafloor. And the scale of these disturbances is incredible. To me, it's kind of like the marine equivalent of a big terrestrial forest fire or drought or bleaching event. But one interesting aspect of this type of disturbance is it's not all that rare. Giant kelp experiences continuous cycles of disturbance and recovery. As you can see, hopefully in this animation, imagine an animation that's showing high variability in giant kelp canopy along the coast of Santa Barbara. I'll show some data that shows this variability later in the talk, and get into the Landsat satellite imagery that we used to create this time series. But essentially, a kelp forest can be completely removed by a big storm event, but then recover in a matter of months. That kind of disturbance affects a lot more than just the kelp itself. Giant kelp is a foundation species, which means it provides the foundation for an entire ecosystem in the form of both food and habitat structure. I think this photo does a good job of depicting that complex habitat that giant kelp creates, much like a terrestrial forest. But I'm never able to describe the importance of giant kelp as eloquently as Charles Darwin did after he traveled to kelp forests along the coast of South America. And so, because of these characteristics I just described, giant kelp forests make an ideal system for studying the ecological consequences of disturbance. And in my talk today, I'm going to address these, to focus on these 2 questions associated with the disturbance and resilience of giant kelp forests. One, how is it that kelp forests can recover from repeated disturbance? And then 2, this goes and explores how this disturbance then affects the complex, productive, and diverse community that giant kelp supports. Now, to get at that first question, we first need to observe multiple cycles of disturbance and recovery. Satellite imagery provides a great tool for this because it allows us to observe kelp on very large space and time scales. And at the Santa Barbara Coastal LTER, we've used Landsat satellite imagery to create a kelp forest monitoring data set that runs pretty much continuously from 1984 to the present and covers all of California and into Baja California. And I'll just mention Landsat is actually, the Landsat program is a series of satellites co-managed by NASA and USGS, and the time series provided by this data is really incredible. We then used long-term in situ monitoring to try to transform these images into a data set that's a little bit more biologically meaningful. So since its inception, the Santa Barbara Coastal LTER has maintained a series of monitoring sites along the coast of Santa Barbara. At these sites, we measure everything from kelp biomass and productivity to kelp forest community structure and biodiversity. 3 of these sites are designated as core sites. We go out every month and make these measurements, which is a huge amount of effort. One of the variables we measure is kelp canopy biomass, and that's what we've used to parameterize and validate our satellite data set. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the satellite image processing, but just in brief, we use a technique called spectral mixing to estimate the fraction of each pixel covered by kelp. Now, these Landsat pixels are 30 meters by 30 meters, and so most of those pixels consist of a combination of kelp and water cover. And so this approach allows us to estimate how much of each pixel is covered by kelp. Then we've taken those pixels that lie on top of our LTER in situ sites and compared that kelp fraction to the diver measure canopy biomass. Found a relatively strong relationship, which allows us to take these Landsat kelp fraction images and turn them into maps of canopy biomass. And we've done this for all of the Landsat images in the archive. And that is a really neat data set. It allows us to look at how kelp abundance has changed through time. Allows us to track the effects of a big disturbance event, identify patches or forests that are particularly persistent or particularly short-lived. So here I'm showing that high variability through time. This is a time series of kelp canopy biomass, a regional time series of kelp canopy biomass across all of Southern California between 1984 through 2017. You can see that really high variability. We tend to see a seasonal cycle with kelp biomass maximums in the late summer, early fall, and then minimums in the late winter or early spring after our big winter storm season. You see multi-year periods of relatively low or high biomass, but you don't see a significant long-term trend, positive or negative. We do see the effects of strong El Niños. Strong El Niños in this area tend to be associated with high levels of wave disturbance and warm, nutrient-poor water conditions, which causes pretty dramatic declines in kelp abundance. But again, you can see that kelp, in many cases, appears to recover relatively rapidly from these disturbances. So we've used this time series to document the importance of wave disturbance in structuring, controlling giant kelp abundance and productivity. Wave disturbance is often overlooked as its driver. This data just shows the saturating relationship between maximum winter wave height and the amount of kelp that's lost in a winter. And so you can see winters with extreme wave disturbance events, we lose almost all of the kelp canopy in the region. And this has important implications for the productivity of these forests. Previous SBC-LTER research has shown that annual productivity of kelp forests is strongly controlled by standing stock of biomass in certain times of the year. In this study, we compared our Santa Barbara LTER sites to kelp forest sites in Central California that experience a lot more wave disturbance. So this just shows the Central California sites in black have higher levels of wave disturbance throughout the year, especially during the winter when waves get really high. We then looked at variability in annual productivity between these two regions and found that wave disturbance explained differences in productivity more so than other variables such as nutrient availability, temperature, grazing pressure. Those Southern California sites with lower wave disturbance on average had twice as much productivity per year, but those sites also showed twice as much variability in productivity. The variability is shown on the bottom right-hand plot there. In Southern California, we do get occasional really large wave events like I showed earlier, but other winters are relatively more subdued, whereas in Central California, they get hammered every single winter. However, even in Central California, where kelp gets wiped out most winters, we typically see very rapid recovery. And so how is this possible? Well, in short, it appears that the connectivity of kelp populations or patches is critical to this resilience. So giant kelp, as you can see here, is patchily distributed along the coast. A adult kelp individual is anchored to the substrate, and so these patches don't move, but patches can interact through the dispersal of a reproductive stage. This stage is microscopic, it sinks very slowly, and so can be moved around by ocean currents. And Santa Barbara LTER research has shown that the dispersal distances for these reproductive stages are on the order of meters to kilometers, which is large enough that neighboring patches, that spores from a single patch can be released and then transported to neighboring patches. We've then examined the role of this demographic connectivity on the resilience, on the recovery of these patches. So a patch in any given location might go extinct, but then be able to be recolonized from reproductive spores from a neighboring patch. We use Landsat imagery to delineate patches of kelp, and believe it or not, wrote an entire paper on how you define a patch, which is more complicated than I could ever have imagined. So we define patches using Landsat, and we track them through time. We identify local extinction events, and then track when those empty patches recover. We then, oceanographers affiliated with this SVC-LTER, then estimate connectivity between patches using ocean current simulations. Essentially, this simulates the release and then transport of those reproductive stages. And we found that well-connected patches are more likely to recover from one of these big disturbance events, and actually less likely to go extinct in the first place. So the left-hand side of this figure shows that as you increase the connectivity of a patch, if it's empty, it has a higher probability in the next 6 months or year of becoming recolonized. And that makes sense. If you're well connected, then a neighboring patch can rescue you after you've gone extinct. The different lines here, the solid versus dashed lines, show different size classes. And here again, larger patches also have a higher probability of being recolonized. We think that this is related to the fact that larger patches represent a larger target for neighboring recolonizing spores. Those large, well-connected patches also have a lower probability of going extinct in the first place. I think this importance of connectivity in supporting kelp resilience can really be seen when you compare these two kelp forests near Santa Barbara. So both of these are LTER sites. They're about the same size, and they're close enough that they experience similar levels of wave disturbance, of nutrient concentrations, sea surface temperatures, etc. If you looked at that well-connected patch in blue, the time series here shown in blue, it got disturbed by the big El Nino in 1997, 1998. That wiped out kelp canopy for this patch, but it recovered relatively quickly, and so, again, shows a high level of resiliency. In contrast, this isolated patch to the east also got nailed by the big El Nino disturbance, but it took about 7 or 8 years to recover. It switched into an urchin barren and showed a lower level of resilience. Okay, so connectivity is critical for the recovery of these patches from these repeated disturbances. But how do those repeated disturbances affect the broader kelp forest community? Charles Darwin wrote, "If in any country a forest was destroyed, I do not believe nearly so many species of animals would perish as would here from the destruction of the kelp." Well, as we've seen, kelp forests are repeatedly destroyed. And so how does the frequency of this disturbance affect the kelp forest community? And one limitation of the satellite approach is that it only shows us what's going on the surface of the water. And so we've conducted a long-term experiment to try to understand the role of disturbance in structure in kelp forest communities. For the last 9 years, we've set up a paired plots at 4 sites along the Santa Barbara coastline. At the high disturbance treatment plot, we clear out all kelp every year to simulate an annual major disturbance. Whereas at the low disturbance control plot, this just sees natural levels of disturbance. And then each season, we measure the abundance and diversity of all the benthic organisms in these plots. And then we've separated those benthic organisms into a series of guilds, such as understory algae, sessile invertebrates, and mobile invertebrates. So we developed a series of statistical models to measure the effects of disturbance frequency on the abundance of those guilds in the form of total biomass. So I'll just step through the results for each guild right now. So for understory algae, those high disturbance plots saw an increase in biomass of understory algae. And we interpret this as the high disturbance plots increase the amount of light that reaches the seafloor by removing giant kelp, which helps those understory algae grow. Kelp is a strong competitor for light, and in low disturbance plots creates that dense canopy that shades the bottom of the seafloor. And we saw diverging effects of disturbance of giant kelp on the 2 different types of sessile invertebrates that we examined. Epilithic invertebrates are found on the surface of the benthos. And here we saw a similar effect of disturbance of giant kelp, whereas high disturbance increased the biomass of epilithic invertebrates. Here we think that this frees up space on the rocky substrate for these organisms. Endolithic invertebrates burrow into the rock, and this gill was really dominated by two types of rock-boring clams. The high disturbance of giant kelp had a negative effect on those rock-boring clams. These are weak competitors for space with the epilithic invertebrates, and so we think there was this indirect effect where high disturbance of kelp promoted epilithic invertebrates, and those outcompeted the rock-boring clams. And then importantly, higher disturbance of giant kelp had a negative effect on both herbivorous and carnivorous invertebrates. And this has important economic implications because these species, things like red sea urchins and spiny lobster, make up some of the most valuable fisheries in this region. So here, high disturbance of giant kelp led to a decrease in the abundance of herbivorous mobile invertebrates. These depend on giant kelp as a primary food source, and so decreases in the abundance and productivity in giant kelp potentially reduce the food source for these herbivorous invertebrates. And then we think there was an indirect effect on the carnivorous invertebrates. Those carnivorous invertebrates prey on the herbivorous invertebrates, and so a decrease in herbivorous invertebrates would cascade into the carnivorous invertebrates. So just to summarize, disturbance of this foundation species alters resource availability in the form of light, space, and food, and has cascading effects on the kelp forest community. As disturbance frequency increases, we see a reduction in giant kelp abundance and productivity, an increase in these understory algae, and a decrease in those mobile invertebrates like sea urchins and spiny lobsters. So we've demonstrated the importance of disturbance in controlling the productivity of giant kelp forests. Disturbance is often overlooked, I think, compared to things like nutrient availability or top-down pressure. It showed that resilience of giant kelp is really driven in large part by the high connectivity, that network structure of giant kelp forests. I just want to say a couple words about this second point. So the good news, if you will, is that in Southern California, we've seen relatively high levels of resilience. We haven't seen long-term declines in kelp. However, the satellite-based approach allows us to compare our site with other sites around the world, and in certain locations we have seen a kind of collapse of this resilience. For example, in Tasmania, over the last few decades, we've seen a decline of up to 95% in giant kelp abundance. This has been associated with prolonged and significant warming due to a shift of the East Australian current. And then more recently and closer to home, there's been sites in Central California that have not been able to recover from the warm events, the El Nino events in 2015 and 16, and prior to that, this warm blob. And here we think this is a function of multiple stressors. So there was that warm, nutrient-limited conditions associated with the El Nino. At the same time, there was an explosion of purple sea urchins, which are a voracious grazer of giant kelp. And so these multiple stressors then have limited, so far, the recovery of these forests. And so we do see that intense and prolonged environmental change or these multiple stressors can push these systems past a tipping point, overwhelming their resilience. And of course, that is going to have important effects on the communities that depend on giant kelp forests. So, thank you very much.
I think we'd like to take a couple of questions, and we'll make up a little time. We're shortening up the break a little bit. Again, for anyone who wants to ask questions, please identify yourself. So,
Going to go to the microphone. Sorry, Paula Benton, NASA headquarters. Very nice talk. So I know quite a bit about the literature and how to define a patch. It is rather painful, but I'm actually more interested in how you define disturbance, particularly in the figure you showed with the El Nino impacts, because you showed very localized impacted regions, yet the El Nino is a lot broader in terms of disturbance. So I was just curious about that piece.
Yeah, so for the patch recovery work, we defined these patches, and then we defined rather than quantifying disturbance, we quantified extinction and recolonization events. And so an extinction event was a period where giant kelp was absent, giant kelp canopy was absent for more than 6 months, right? So in certain cases, the kelp canopy can be wiped out, but there's still subsurface kelp that can grow back relatively quickly. If you don't see canopy for more than 6 months, over a year, then we can be pretty confident that kelp patch has gone locally extinct. So that's how we define extinction events. And then a recolonization event occurred when we saw canopy return to an extinct patch. So for that work, again, we focus more on extinctions and recolonizations rather than measure or define a disturbance in kind of like a physical manner.
I'll try from over here. Suzanne Menadoyer, Graduate School of Oceanography at URI. I was wondering, does the charismatic macrofauna play any role in setting the kelp ecosystem?
Absolutely. So there are, I focused on disturbance here. We know that nutrient limitation plays a role. We know that top-down effects play a role, and that has been implicated in some of these. Some of the situation that we're seeing in Central California. So the purple sea urchin, like I said, is a major grazer of giant kelp. And so it is preyed upon by larger things like spiny lobsters or certain types of fish. And so we've seen that disturbance in the form of overfishing releases those sea urchins from predation and can allow those populations to explode. And that potentially may be happening in Central California here. So if those grazers populations explode, they can graze down giant kelp and maintain those urchin barrens that are largely devoid of giant kelp. So certainly top-down effects are absolutely important.